kind of turn my,
Sorry, I forgot to record. Okay.
no, that's totally fine. I'm glad because I've taught Zoom classes and I forget that's like halfway through and I feel so terrible. But yeah, so what was I going to say? Oh, so a lot of my work has to do with looking at natural processes and how the earth makes things, which is a fancy way of saying I really like rocks and the stories that get embedded on them. And so what I'd like to do is kind of shift a lot of my practice and look more critically at the materials I'm using, thinking
Mm.
about how I can kind of bring more of the environment into them and also how I can bring that into the classrooms that I'm part of. I really liked last week when you were talking a bit about, oh, I forgot the term, so sorry. But like our specific like bioregions, because a lot of times when I've kind of done like workshops with more environmentally minded individuals, sometimes they're like, well, go out into the desert and you can forage your own materials. But I'm in Chicago. I'm in a very urban area and I don't have a desert at my disposal. And I'm sometimes working with schools that have very small budgets or small time constraints. And so I really want to kind of meet people where they are and kind of meet a lot of this where I am right now. So excited to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Amazing. Do you know there's an awesome is it called the Waste Shed in Chicago?
Yes, the waste shed is amazing. I make all my students go there. It's oh,
It's great. It's
it's
one of those
fun.
warehouses where people just like there's a massive one in New York City. I forget the name of it, but it's like a space for educators or artists to come and buy like super low priced basically just it's kind of like a thrift store for art supplies. It's like a place where people donate a lot of stuff and then you can come and buy things very cheaply. And I feel like it's like a cooperative, like collectively owned situation. It's yeah, but there's a lot of those in many cities across the states and in small cities too. So you should scope out what's around you. Okay, I'm gonna start. I'm just full disclosure, I'm getting over an awful head cold this week, so I'm gonna try and pace myself. And I might have to take moments to like pause. But I'm feeling good today. Okay. I was looking up art. Beautiful work. Okay, so today we're going to talk about processes. And I want to I mentioned this last week, but just a reminder of where to find. So I'm going to go through a variety of processes today, just sort of overview of different processes like making inks and paints and brushes. But there, as I mentioned last time, it was just kind of brought up in conversation. A lot of these practices that are engaging the natural environment around you are going to look different based on the bioregion that you're in. So you might be looking at recipes online, but they may not make total sense for where you are. And it comes with practice and really learning your land that you will start to find reliable uh, practices that you like. It's like I make black walnut ink here, and I've done it. I'll show you guys some examples of this, but I've spent, a year scoping out the trees and watching for when I might harvest them, and then doing many different tests and realizing when I need to harvest or how I need to store them to get certain shades that I was really looking for. So just to say, this all comes in practice, and it's all like a very much process oriented practice. So okay, so we're here, session two. Uh, there is, as I mentioned last time, so last time when we went to this CAES website, it brought you to a sort of more expanded upon uh text talking about some of the topics that I was talking about. But this link brings you to a page of all of these different resources under different mediums. So, and these are resources that Yvonne has collected in his research. So a lot of them are like black and white scanned images from like textbooks that he found God knows where. And many of them are old. I also always recommend doing a Google search. If you're like, I want to make paper, or I want to crush up bricks to make paint with them. I always recommend I scope several different, I would recommend looking through these resources, looking through another set of resources that I'm going to show you, and doing a Google search, in addition to like whatever else you're doing in the field. So there's some text about natural dyes here, canvas and grounds, brushes. There's also a few videos that Yvonne made about charcoal. Charcoal making is so fun and easy. Um, you essentially, I don't know that I have a. But you essentially all you need is a tin can, and you seal the top with a metal wire, and you're putting pieces of wood inside of it, and that goes into a fire for 1 hour. I have a lot of pictures of this, and I'm wondering now if I did put them in this slideshow we're going to look at. So I'm just touching on it now, but charcoal making is something I do a lot of. If anybody wants to talk more about that in depth, I'm happy to like meet one-on-one. Paper making is something that a lot of my students do. Like every time I teach this class, I feel like there's at least 2 or 3 people who make paper. And this is something that you can go really in depth with, or you can do in a very simple way, like with a blender and paper and water, and then like a like screen, any screen. It's also fun to do with kids. I've done it with kids in a number of different contexts with like using a blender. um Glues and adhesives, book arts, ceramics is this is something I actually want to learn a lot more about. But what is here is what Yvonne has offered. It's not something that I personally have done much of myself yet, but though I'm planning to learn how to do that in the next year. So, okay, so there's that resource for you guys, but then the other resource for processes is underneath the link that I just clicked on at the CAES website is this eco art resource Google folder, which is the folder I was talking about last time. It's like a folder of folders, and this is a living document where I started this because when I started teaching this class, I had, yes, Yvonne's resources, but in the process of teaching the class, so many other resources came into play, whether it was from the students or for me. And so this is a place where you guys will have like always have access to, where you can add stuff to it and help build out this library, and also just use whatever you can find in here. But just with a disclaimer that a lot of this is a pretty like fresh project. So there's in some areas are really lacking information, but if you have anything you want to add and share, that would be awesome. And I add to like here's Maria Elena's notes and tips on like natural dyeing. So when I have guest artists, if they have anything to share, I also add that to these folders. So I'm gonna go into the slideshow for today, and we're gonna talk about just like touch upon what goes into building a sustainable art studio. And that was Nick Netto. We'll talk about him later. So establishing a sustainable studio, it's not a common thing because it's not convenient. It's just not going to be convenient. And that's part of what I love about it. But you're constantly kind of asking what systems are in place around me and how do I start to prepare ahead of time, tuning your mind to what you're looking for, and then you'll find it when it comes across your path. Like, so for example, if I start saying to myself, I want to learn how to make natural inks. Then I might do a little research like, oh, what can I make natural inks from? Oh, like the acorn tree or the black walnut tree. I can make it from acorns or black walnuts, or oak galls. So then I look up those trees, and then as I'm going on walks, I start to look around, and then I start to find them. This is, it's not, it's like, it's these, it takes time because part of it is learning your land. For those who are in rural context and in cities, it's like, oh, what, like the waste shed, like what, and Maria Elena was talking, for example, about developing relationships with, um, local food hubs where she was acquiring the avocado pits, right? So it's like about maybe in a more city environment, it's about relationship building and context like that. And so tuning your mind to what you're looking for. Oh yeah, and then when you find out, you'll come across your path. It's a slow process. And it's something that we all have to navigate in our own way, in our own context. Building the sturdy foundation for a sustainable studio practice can be a slow process. For example, I kind of just talked about this, but I suggest that you take a whole year to observe what materials and resources you have access to around you, tuning yourself to the process of creating your stations. Like, what stations do you need to set up to process whatever endeavor you're taking on, and your workspace, and picking out your processes. Once you begin to take stock of what and who is around you, you'll develop a familiarity with when to harvest, store, and process. Uh, so reduce, reuse, recycle, collecting tools, containers, always being on the lookout for new tools and materials, storing dried materials sealed and out of the sun, cool room temperature. And I also say, like, careful not to hoard, because depending on your practice, like for some people, it can be very generative to have an overabundance of like things around you that you are pulling from and creating with. Like, I think a lot of that's often the case with sculptors. But then there are other people where it's just like having so much that they're holding on to can feel like it's sort of a writer's block. Like it like holds you back. It creeps you from like creating, because you're kind of overwhelmed with everything around you. But yeah, containers, I mean, the obvious, like I save a million different types of containers. Uh, anywhere from like plastic to containers for yogurt to spaghetti glass jars. And these all become my like paint containers and dye containers and ink containers. I recycle clothes that I don't want to wear anymore for rags. There's a million ways we can reuse and recycle. And so process stations is something too to think about. Typically, oftentimes, depending on the practices that you want to take on, you're going to need a water or a fire station. So fire sources, it's like, what are your common options? Is fire pit, which would be amazing if you had access to that, but most of us may not. An electric burner, but I caution with electric burners. Yvonne was telling me that they use a lot of energy. That he like did a test, and one had like something like 600 watts an hour. But there's a way to test. I don't know the name of the tool, but you can test these things. And then ovens, obviously. Um, filters is a big one. I use a lot of filters, a lot of different kinds of filters. You can think of coffee filters. You could also use a coffee machine to brew things. There's the sky's the limit here. Thinking about different cooking materials can often be used in some of these processes. Cooking, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Machines. So also, we're thinking about a water source, really important to consider. Where is your water coming from and where is your water going? When we're thinking about what we're putting down the faucet. And that's where also filters can really come into play. And inevitably, and many of us, for some of us, our practices are going to involve some toxic materials. So Oh, before I speak to that, I wanted to also say, yeah, thinking about the amount of water you're using. Like, some of these processes are very intensive. So, and if you're in a very, dehydrated area where droughts are really common, it's just something you might want to take into consideration. Or is there like excessive heavy rains, and like there's excessive quantities of water that are moving through your terrain? Toxic disposal. So I suggest if you have toxic disposal, locate hazardous waste drop-off sites near you. And you can like mark those dates, the dates of pickup or drop off on your calendar. And you can sieve out toxic materials like paint solvents in separate containers, lead, heavy metals, old paint rags. Um, so, okay, this is something that Yvonne likes to talk about, but it's negotiating sustainability in a classroom. In classrooms, we often don't have a lot of control, right? And we're sometimes like given materials that we have to use. And so if you can't walk the talk, consider it still as a teaching opportunity, because you can like talk about like what are you doing that isn't sustainable, and like demonstrate that to the kids, and like pass on this mindset of like thinking critically about our use around materiality in creative like context in the classroom. Um, and oh gosh, you a lot of times it's going to involve a lot of preparation time before for working when working with kids. It's like how have you where did you like I'm thinking of, and I'll share this later. I was working with this Puerto Rican mask maker with kids, and we would like, well, you have to go find that cardboard, like prepare the paint, like get things ready. Are you, if you're working with natural inks or dyes, are you simmering the coffee grinds beforehand? Um, but teaching settings are very high impact scenarios, in terms of like passing on sustainable mindsets and frameworks. I love this quote by Nick Netto. Would anybody like to read it? Nick Netto is a land wildcrafter artist based in Vermont. Nobody? Okay, we got a shy group. Okay, I'll read it. I interviewed Nick about his practice when I was doing my master's in art education, about basically what all this class is about. And yeah, it was very insightful to talk to him. This is some of his practices down here, and I'll show some of his books. But so here we go. Making your own tools and processing materials for doing so from the landscape is unbelievably satisfying on a profound and even instinctive level. Much of this satisfaction comes from the process of transformation that occurs each time we make something from another thing. One of the results of making things from the landscape by hand is the unavoidable deepening of one's knowledge of and relationship to the local bioregion where we live. Through working with raw materials, we begin to learn to speak the language of that particular material. We have to use our awareness in order to observe the specific characteristics, strengths, and limitations that are unique to the material. Through this level of interaction, a conversation begins, where we learn to be receptive to the feedback the raw materials provide as we manipulate them to take the shape and function that we desire. Ultimately, this level of participation with the landscape is a path to help us remember that we are part of its natural history and ecology, not just a visitor like an astronaut on a foreign planet. And he has these two books, which are really great, especially if you're working with kids. This is really helpful. Um, and he goes through all the steps to make these different processes, like paint, paper, pigments, prints. So when you're working with, when you're wildcrafting, um, it's really process oriented approach, not product oriented. And the medium, I really like to think of it as the medium becomes your teacher, and the medium becomes the clock, right? So, and this is sort of where I think the beauty of it is, but also I can appreciate for many the frustration or the like deterring factor of it is that you're losing control in a lot of ways. So you like have to wait for a certain part of the season to harvest something, and but the way that these things set us back, I think they also draw us in towards being in more entangled like means of engagement with the human or the non-human world around us. And so most importantly, and I think this is one of the more exciting parts for me, is the material becomes part of the story behind your work. So the material starts to shape the why and what it is that you're creating. It like starts to eke its way into like what the direction of what you're doing. And I think that's really cool when that happens. Um, so I'm going to talk next about paint and pigments. This is something I know quite a bit about. I'm not an expert in some of the other practices like paper making. I had an amazing, I think I've had two paper makers come in and speak before. So if anybody is interested in that, I'll send you a link of their artist talk, which is really wonderful. But I'm a painter. I know a lot about paints and pigments and inks. And so something that I like to off the bat clarify for those who aren't familiar with working with paint or ink is that paint is so first I'll talk about paint is a pigment, which so it's like a particle that has so I like to think of it as now these have been synthetically dyed, but imagining these were straight off of the color of a rock, like this is essentially like crushed rock or crushed calcium carbonate that's been dyed. And so the color is being held in a particle, which is very different from ink, because with ink, you're extracting color from like a root, for example. But with paint, you have a pigment and then you have a binder. And the binder is what holds the pigment onto a surface, right? So our pigments are these ingredients, it's like cooking. Like our pigments could be a whole myriad of different things, and so could our binders. So in pigments, there's natural pigments and there's synthetic pigments. Natural made by grinding and washing clay or minerals, and it's often non-toxic. And then synthetic coming into the modern era, where we're bringing like natural pigments through chemical processes to bring out these really heightened colors. So binders. So binders are ingredients that provide a binding effect that holds the pigments together to create a dry film on the surface. The paint's binder is the key ingredient that directly relates to a paint's performance, including adhesion, washability, scrub resistance, fade resistance, or gloss retention. So here's some examples of binders: drying oil, wax, acrylic, which is like plastic essentially, honey, egg yolk, which I'll talk about, and there's many more. It's worth mentioning that certain mediums don't want to combine with other mediums. For example, water-based mediums like acrylic don't want to sit on top of oil mediums. If you think of the way that oil and water react, right? So it's so you can probably do it if the oil paint is really dry, but generally speaking, especially if the oil paint is wet, you're never going to be able to put acrylic on top of oil. It'll start to bead and it won't really work. But you can do the opposite. You can do acrylic, a water-based medium, and then put oil on top of that. So here's just some beautiful examples of natural pigments, just to say we can get, like I talked about in the last class, thinking of sort of pre-industrial revolution era where we were synthetically altering the color of pigments to get these really bright colors, and pre-globalization and like the trade of pigments. You like in art history, the colors that you see in a culture's art reflect the landscape around them because they're using the pigments around them. And this is just to show you like how beautiful natural pigments can be. And then synthetic pigments. So these are like chemically altered pigments, but it's how we get these like really bright colors, which can be toxic. So you have to be careful with the synthetic modern pigments. So grinding pigments, one of my students, by the way, Susan Snipes Art, she is a photographer and she just did such a beautiful job documenting like what she did in this class. And she lives in Cleveland and she was going along the shores of Lake Erie and finding these beautiful rocks or bricks and then making her own pigments with them for her paintings. And you can use a mortar and pestle, but a lot of times people will also have a molar, which like molds down, they actually think even an electric molar that I've seen. I was working as a gilder for some time, and my boss he would mold down the clay to get it super fine. Um, and typically, the way that you will integrate a binder to pigment is you'll have a palette knife, and oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of this tool that you go around in circles to integrate the pigment into the binder. And oftentimes you'll first mix it with water. I also, like, cheap trick, put the pigment and the water or whatever well, I start with water often, unless I'm going to use an oil binder, just to get the pigment moist. But I'll put the pigment and whatever binder or a little water in a jar like this and just shake it really hard. And that also can work depending on what ingredients you're using to integrate things. So here, is this called a molar? I think this is also called a molar. Yeah, it's a glass molar. Sorry, there's a molding machine is what I was referring to earlier. So here's like the integration of the pigments with the oil. And you want to use your palette knife to scrape it up and protect your eyes and lungs when you're doing this, because you do not want to be inhaling these pigments. Even the like non-toxic ones, you just don't want this stuff in your lungs. You got to be really careful with the synthetic ones because some of them are very toxic, especially the cadmiums or cobalts. I recommend better eye protection than what's going on here. So okay, a couple of suggestions if you wanted to buy pigments and binders. Um, my this is a cool project I wanted to mention, which is John Sabra. He turned acid mine drainage into non-toxic pigment and paints, which are now available through Gamblin, which is just pretty cool of a project. They're beautiful colors too. And this is sort of about his process of like going into polluted streams and collecting the toxic runoff, extracting the iron oxide, which becomes the pigment, and then like, preparing it for packaging. So I was living in New York City and for like 5 or 6 years, and that's where I learned a lot about pigment, about making my own material. This is where I first started learning about. I got really started geeking out on making my own paints. Was that Kramer Pigments? They do classes there too. And so it's basically like they have all these rows of different pigments, and they're separated by like natural pigments, synthetic pigments. And then over on the other side, they have all of these different binders. And this is what they're known for their watercolors. They have these beautiful, they're more like gouaches, honestly, because they're color bound to like calcium carbonate and they're quite opaque. But they this is what started getting me this and working as a giller, because you're using all traditional materials like calcium carbonate and rabbit skin glue, and so but then I was like, all right, I want to get out into the land and figure out how to do some of this stuff. But we'll talk about oak galls in a bit. On their website, they have like these different recipes. I'm not getting paid to talk about them. I do enjoy. They've been a great resource for me. They have different like recipes for all these different processes. It can be a helpful resource. And they're really great too if you ever want to call them up and like ask them about something. I did want to touch upon egg tempera because this is such a great thing to do with kids. It's because it's so like it's safe, it's gross, they love it, it's fun. But you're essentially using the inside of the egg yolk. That's the part of the egg that you want to use. And so talk about like building relationships. Like I have a local grocer who I basically like I just went out, I was like, hey, I'm an artist. Do you have any extra, can you like maybe you could let me know when you have excess eggs that you're gonna throw out? And then I like gave him some of my prints, and we like and I'm in relation with them. I tell them about the work I'm doing with like kids, and they're like love it. And just to say, like, thinking about the systems we're around, bringing that up again. Um, so you want to drain. So typically, what you'll do is you'll hold the egg yolk in your hand and sort of toss it from palm to palm without breaking it, trying to get as much of the egg white off as you can, and then you want to pinch, like poke a hole in the egg sac and drain it out. So you don't want the egg sac, you want what's inside of the egg sac. And if you poke a hole and sort of hold it upside down, it will start to drain out. You can use the egg white to create a glare, but this is not something I've done much of. I was in a class where we did it one time. But you're like whipping it essentially. You like whip the egg white and all this foam comes up, and what you want is what's under the foam because that foam holds the impurities, and the egg white, that's the glare that's left there, can be used as a glaze in oil paint, and I think for a variety of other things. Um, but yeah, you can use vinegar to cut the smell. I've kept it in the fridge for 3 to 4 days. Some people might say it's a little long, or they've kept it longer. So, it's up to you. And you use water to dilute it. Yeah, I recommend that. So here's an example. I'm doing, these are all pigments that I mixed from I got primary pigments from Kramer, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red, and mix them to create this color wheel on a hide that I got at Parchment, or sorry, at Pergamena. So this is Parchment. Uh, Pergamena is one of the only uh parchment paper distributors makers in the US, and there's very few in the world actually, and their processes go back through like a German lineage of the people who own it, like 500 years. And yeah, this is talked at length about in the documentary that I brought up, the Nova documentary in the last class. Around, like, how this is how the Book of Kells were made, the illuminated manuscripts. Like in Europe, information text traveled much slower because they were using parchment to like write on, which is both very labor intensive to create, but also much slower to write on compared to like papyrus, for example, in the East, where information just spread like wildfire because it's so much easier to collect and write on. So anyways, now let's talk about inks and dyes. How are we on time? Okay, pretty good. So inks and dyes are, so as I mentioned, the inks and dyes are different from pigment where the color is held in a particle, because in inks and dyes, you are extracting color from a organic matter, organic material, like oak galls, or barks, roots, walnut husks, acorns. And so you're simmering these organic materials in water, and then you strain out the organic material, and what you have left is the water, the like soup that it was cooking in. That's the ink. So it's not like held in a pigment. You can make lake pigments, like kind of like gouache, where if you have a color like that color that you create, that ink you create, you can bind it onto like calcium carbonate, like a almost like a chalk malt pig particle. But we're not going to talk about that. It's a little more complicated. Inks are really simple. They're so accessible, great thing to do with kids. An important thing to note right off the bat is that colors will fade. Any colors you use are gonna fade. It's so sad. But what colors won't fade is like colors that are rich in tannins, which I'll talk about, which tend to be like earth colors. Like I've had my black walnut paintings up for almost a couple years now, and they have not faded because they're so rich in tannin. And I'll talk about how you can make a black that will not fade either. But a lot of colors, like, free that you might see people making from like, you know, uh, onion peels, or like flowers and beets, they are unfortunately going to fade. It's just sort of a matter of time. You can protect things, like say you're working with kids and they are working in a sketchbook and like you keep it closed most of the time. But so yeah, we're talking about color extraction. Preservation is also quite simple. You could use salt, rubbing alcohol, thyme oil. There's a lot of different like essential oils you could use to keep the ink from like molding. Honey, vinegar, and you can adjust the consistency, which I'll talk a little bit more about with like honey, gum arabic, or gelatin. So oak gall ink, I learned about oak gall ink studying with Carolyn Ross, who is based in the UK. And she like sent us these oak galls from the UK that are way thicker than the oak galls that I find in like Northeast America that are really thin and they do not give off as much ink. So I just want to say that as a disclaimer. But the process I'm about to talk about works for any ink with a tannin, which is so you're essentially the combination of a tannin and an iron creates a chemical reaction that creates a black. So if you think of what color is iron, right? It's kind of like this color. It's like rust, which is so iron is essentially you could acquire iron just by putting some rusty nails in water, letting it sit. You could add a little vinegar to speed up the process. And when, or you could actually buy iron tablets. When those mix with a tannin, that chemical reaction occurs and it creates a permanent black. And that is how, like, the black ink, for example, was made that was used as far back as like the Magna Carta, the Book of Kells. And art historians or not art historians, people who look at the way that art ages. I'm forgetting the name of this. They say it darkens for like the first 500 years. So it's really kind of, and you can make subtle adjustments. You don't have to go all the way black, and also this might be obvious, but you can adjust the darkness of your ink by just simmering it longer. The longer you simmer the ink, the more water is going to boil off, the more deep the tone is going to be, right? So here's an example. These are the oat galls that she sent us. It's like preparing your iron water. Okay, so let me touch upon what is a tannin. A tannin is a naturally occurring polyphenol found in plant seeds, bark, wood, leaves, fruit skins. The term tannin comes from the ancient Latin word for tanner and refers to the use of bark to tan hides. And Joanne, I see you have your hand up.
I just wanted to add,
Yeah.
since we're talking about nature, with galls, that sometimes inside the galls are living like little wasps.
Yeah.
And also there are smaller galls that on pin oak trees, to be extremely careful of. They have oak mites. And if you start to get bitten by them, thousands of them can bite you. And
Wow.
I've had that experience
Wow.
twice, where my
Oh,
entire body was just
oh,
covered in like the itch mites from
oh my
being
God.
underneath a tree that, just let loose thousands of them.
Wow. Thank you for
So,
sharing that.
so careful with some things with collecting nature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tread lightly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you too for speaking to the oak gall. I didn't mention this, but it's made from a wasp inserts an enzyme into the oak tree, and then the oak tree spits out the oak gall, and inside is a little baby wasp enzyme that slowly eats its way out. So when I'm looking for oak galls, I hunt for them on the ground near oak trees and look for a little hole because that means the wasp has left the shell. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
Gosh, well, that's so awful
It's
too.
awful.
Oh,
We have the cicada here.
yeah.
It was one of the epicenters of the brood X, brood 10, 17-year cicada. And what I didn't know was that the oak mites feed off of the new nymphs. So that was
Mhm.
my first experience of being just covered in these bites from
Oh
them.
gosh.
and they itch like you can't stop it. It's horrible.
Oh my gosh.
So
Okay,
beware.
I need to make a note about that. Thank you for
The
sharing that.
pin oak trees, the galls on them.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your sharing that.
Okay.
Another ink that you can make is acorn ink, and which is a similar process to black walnut ink, which I'm actually going to talk a little bit in depth because this is something I do a lot in my practice. Um, and so this is black walnut ink here. And the way, so this is a black walnut tree, and quite close to my studio where I collected these black walnuts from. And I did add some oak galls, but essentially you're just simmering for hours and hours, and it really starts to break down. And I'll actually sieve it out and then reuse it and make it like a second batch, and then just that second batch will be weaker, but I'll boil it down so it's just as like thick and dark. And I'm working at really large scales, so I'm making a lot of ink. So it's, it's much simpler at smaller scales. But what I do is I set up, and again, this, depending on the scale you're working, this may not be necessary, but my setup is just a wooden frame, and that I line with plastic that I found from like a gallery department was just throwing it out. And I have these big clips, and then I hang dry the paper after I dip it. I just dip it in and then I hang dry it. And I'll do like 4 or 5 dips. And with this piece, here, I drew on the paper with oil sticks. And then because I was talking about earlier, the oil resists water, right? So sometimes you can use these relationships between mediums to your advantage to like play with the interactions. So the oil resisted the ink, which is really cool. And it sort of like bled like that in some areas. Um, and I won't talk about the work because there was just too much to cover, but this is wax that resists the black walnut ink. So that was also really cool to work with. And this is pastel colored pencil on top of the sheets of the black walnut ink that were dipped. And then also like, so this is all an ode to my grandmother who passed away, but then I'm also run a storytelling collective. And so I'm just bringing this up to say, like, this is something we're going to talk about next time, is how do you engage your community in your practice, right? How do you tell the story of like, and so here I have all the materials that I used on down the ground here, and people were using charcoal that I made. And I talked about how like a lot of these materials are made, and they're like ceramic cups that are all part of it. So like how is like the practice? So it's also process oriented is what I'm getting at. And it's rooted in community practice, your land and your community. Just thinking about, all right, bioregion identities, right? Context, where are we? Who are we around? Thickening, altering, consistency. So if you want to alter the consistency of your inks and like sort of thicken them, you can boil them down, but you could to make them darker and a bit thicker. But you can also add honey or I use this watercolor medium often. With my black walnut ink, I don't use any mediums. I just use the ink straight up. But if you wanted to alter the consistency, here are a couple ways you could do it. And this is just like really one step off from watercolors. Like watercolors are essentially like really condensed. Actually watercolors often they're a bit more like paints in the sense that they're most often not necessarily condensed inks, but paint. So like the pigment is in the color is the pigment, and then the binder is often gum arabic, glycerin, honey, and it's just sort of condensed, right? And watercolors are great because they're great to travel with. They're great teaching mediums. You just dry and re-wet. And here's a great like watercolor resource. That somebody told me about. I haven't bought their paints myself because I don't work too much in watercolors, but they're worth checking out. Beam paints. I think these are like the holding containers are made from like waxed canvas. That's what it looks like. Wildcrafting brush tools can also be really fun. I learned how to do some of this with Carolyn Ross again. I mentioned her. I'll show her too. But yeah, we just use the tips of feathers, and this is the part of the feather. This is another part of this same feather, if that makes sense. Like this is closer to the root of the feather, and this is up towards the top of the feather. And then that becomes the what holds this in place over this, excuse me, over the stick. And this is how you can get some very fine lines, and you can also carve your own pen tools in this way. Not like, this is like I don't use this reliably because I can't get a reliable line, but if you really learn how to craft them well, you sure can. But it's also fun to do with kids because it's just you're engaging like sticks you can find outside. These are some beautifully crafted examples from Nick Netto using different fibers, animal hairs, like pine needles. So here's as I mentioned, beet ink, so beautiful. Unfortunately, the colors are gonna fade. Berry ink, I did this, the Smithsonian Museum. Yeah, I was just doing helping them do a kids it's during COVID activity of like how they can make their own paints or inks with berries. Another fun thing to do with kids, just salt and vinegar to strain them. Oh, and test things. Can't recommend this enough. Take tests. And oftentimes if you really want to find if you want reliable information, you want to know how to replicate certain colors. I mean, you could go as far as to make 2 test tablets, and one you put in a window, one you keep in your sketchbook to see how light is impacting things differently and date things, right? Highly recommend. Natural dyes. Okay. So I'm going to try and go quickly through the last bit. Natural dyeing is typically involves natural fibers and typically animal or plant fibers, right? The process, and I've done just a little bit of this. I'm just dipping my toes into this water of the last month or two. But it's an in-depth process. But you scour, you want to clean the fabric, and then you want to mordant it. And a mordant is something that binds, it creates a bond between the fiber and the dye. So you're preparing that fiber to receive the dye. Tannins are naturally found in certain tannins, which we talked about, are in a way natural binders. Natural mordants. But I think to play it safe, you want to maybe also use a mordant. A common mordant that people use is alum. There are some organic mordants, but I don't know enough about this yet. There are some resources though, as I pointed to earlier. And then you have your dye. So look at all these dyes here that you can make. So while I said inks fade, that dyes do not, and that's where the mordant comes in. You're preparing the fabric to freeze a color encounter. So it becomes light fast. So that's sort of the difference between, you can get these organic, beautiful colors that if you were to make an ink from them and paint them on paper, that would fade. But with a dye, and it just takes dyeing definitely takes practice. If you know anybody around you who knows how to do natural dyeing, I highly recommend pulling their ear before going about it entirely on your own, because that's for me the best way that I learned. You can also use pH, alter the pH balance to adjust colors. Acidics tend to lean cooler, like lemon or apple cider vinegar, and alkalines tend to create a warmer tones. So the options of what you can come up with are just endless. It's really amazing. So here's some examples. Okay, I want to touch on too. So your decisions about sourcing materials might be based on one or many of these approaches. Formal, how do the physical properties and the qualities of the material, regardless of historical or social context, create the visual impact that I want? Conceptual, how does the history of the use of this material in art contribute to the meaning of my project? Political economy, how does the extraction, circulation, and distribution of this material contribute to the meaning of my project? So, like, this is to say that the medium can be the message so often. Like, I had a student last class who was working with recovered oil mines, like these massive oil mines that I forget the actual name for them, and she was also using clay from the site of these mines. And I worked with somebody too who's using gasoline, for example. Like, these are very like loaded materials to work with, right? And they carry a whole meaning and a history and systems with them when you're using them, when you're engaging them. Cultural, social, spiritual, how does the material make meaning in my cultural, social, spiritual community? And sorry, one last thing I want to touch on is, we're talking about sustainability, but we're talking about, like, in like art making that is rooted in socio-ecological context, right? It's like you're mindfully thinking about the socio-ecological context in the act of creation. And so, like, yes, we can talk about making sustainable materials, but as I was kind of just alluding to, like, maybe using like fossil fuels in a certain context is the thing that like is actually really what is potent and wakes people up and like really thinking about their environment and their relationship to their environment, right? Um, so, okay, personal mythology. How does the material relate to a mythology I am creating about myself? Ontological or phenomenological. How am I in relation with the materials that I am working with? What is my impact on them and what is their impact on me? Oh, Joanne.
Yes, since you bring this up, I would just like to kind of open this for, if you don't mind, just for a second.
Yeah,
Sometimes when you're using these toxic materials to bring attention, you're also creating beauty. And that sometimes becomes a complex dialogue, I think. Like
totally.
what are your
Yeah, like who's,
thoughts on that, or other people in the group? I mean,
oh, wait, I'd love to hear if anybody else has a thought on that.
because that very thing, when you're using the oil to bring attention, yet you're creating beauty, can be a confusing message, I think.
Yeah, like there's a lot of photographers, for example, who are documenting climate change in like ways that are, there's a couple of specific ones that I'm for forgetting their names, but it's they're yeah, God, I wish we had just like 10 minutes to talk about this because I have like 10 minutes more of material to share, but we're also like at time. But so I'm
Okay,
trying to
well,
get
you know
fast.
what,
No, it's a great question though, because so yeah, thinking about what is the impact of the work that I'm creating, and there are a lot of critiques around like, so artists, for example, who are photographing these like, site mines and like sites of intense extraction or of like humans and the land across the globe, but they're these miraculous photographs, right? What is that doing to the viewer, right? It's like it's very complicated, it's important to think about. Yeah.
yeah, well,
But
one
it's
of them
like the
is,
beauty in the chaos.
yeah.
The beauty in the chaos. Like, when the fires are really bad, the sunsets are amazing. It's the duality of everything, I think.
it's that's definitely present, but it's also I've heard some really powerful critiques on work like this where it's I think it's worth it considering the ways that um um it becomes an object of beauty and not something that's really like doing the work of shifting the culture.
and they might say, what is, what is my responsibility? Because I did witness this. It's Edward Bertinsky is one photographer that does that. And I witnessed at a like a photo festival how the curators and everyone in the audience suddenly started attacking him.
Ah,
Where he was the keynote speaker and showing
oh yeah, yeah.
this work that he does, but all of a sudden, it brought into question, um, and he was trying to explain his point of view, and that hopefully that people will see this
Yeah.
as well of what he shows, some of his work about oil, and they're really powerful, but it can really almost backfire too when you're trying to get people to look, because you do want to use your artistic skills, it's
Right, but it's the back, yeah, but it's like you're romanticizing it at the same time.
right, but I don't think he really is in his heart. I mean, I think he knows he's not.
I'm sure that his intentions are, yeah. It's
He's
just,
been doing it a long time, but it was, it's just interesting.
yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I'm part of me wants to like add another class in this whole series just for this is the more discussions like this can happen because I think they're so important. Um, so okay, I want to pass it off. I'm supposed to pass off to Anna right now. Anna, do you mind if I go just a couple minutes over?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can, yeah.
No, go ahead. And
Okay.
I'm enjoying it, so I'll just sit and wait.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'll be quick. Um, working with kids. Okay, working with kids, I wanted to just touch on, here's another example of like, this is the Puerto Rican mask maker that I worked with. It was so awesome to work with him. And he was just talking about this whole history of using paper mache and cardboard in his culture to create these wild masks. And so we did this practice with a lot of kids from just like recycled cardboard. This is a great book too, for like learning with found materials with kids, for anybody who's working with kids. Take a screenshot. Um, you could also make kitchen clay, but I'm not gonna really go, it's just simple. It's like flour and salt, and then you can like add dye and you bake it. Fun thing to do with kids. I wanted to talk about a couple artists, and I think I'll be done. So here's, for example, Abina. She's actually a Chicago-based artist who uses a variety of ephemeral materials such as plastic, tea, dirt, coffee, and charcoal to comment on displacement, past memories, and culture of creating. So I'm just showing you a few artists where it's like the materials can become part of the message, right? Helen Hybert is a paper maker. She makes these wild sculptures with paper. If you're interested in paper making, I would check her out. And also Michelle Brody, who I don't have in here, but she is somebody who talked to my class about paper making. So if anybody is interested in paper making, I'll send you her artist talk. Carolyn Ross I love Carolyn Ross. I've studied with her a couple of times. And she has a great Instagram. She's just constantly posting stuff that she's doing with wild crafting materials. And she's based in the UK, but she's actually going to come teach in Massachusetts in May with her co-teacher these days who she's been working with, who teaches high tanning. So she also makes cordage, which is really great. Like I think we use nettle was what we use, but you can make it from many different materials. And Nick Netto, who we talked about, you can see he makes baskets too up here. And obviously, like he's made everything he's wearing. And this is some of it, like the ink that he's made, create these drawings. And oh, this is just an example of like inside of his books, what they look like. So making these little clay vessels. And oh yeah, okay. I'm gonna show, I wanna pause here and take a really quick bio break and then pass it off to Anna. Is that okay? And is it Anna or Anna? It is Anna, right?
Yes, Anna.
Okay,
Different
thank
from
you.
you. Same spelling.
I have to run to the bathroom, but I'll be back in like 2 or 3 minutes. And you could start. I feel bad not being here, but some other people might have to go to the bathroom as well. So maybe we'll come
We
back.
can wait
Cool. Okay, we'll be back in like 3
minutes.
minutes.
Okay,
Yeah,
sounds good.
3 to
I'll wait
5
for you.
minutes. We'll see when people come back on.
Okay.
We'll be able to see the whole thing, right? On video.
What do you mean by the whole thing?
Everything we just did.
Oh yeah, yeah.
For
This is,
those resources. Okay, great.
yeah.
Is that a photograph that you took behind you?
Oh, me? No, this is not.
Hmm.
I was just wondering what's in Anna's background.
I can answer your question. It's a piece, a collage piece I found in a dumpster.
Wow.
And I built a little oak frame, and I've enjoyed watching it fade in the light. It's been a lovely piece to watch. I have no idea the story behind it.
I love that. I love the story that you have though with it.
Well, Anna, I'll just wait for your
Yeah, I think
thumbs up.
Marian and Luba. Cool. Okay. I think we can begin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you, Anna and ecoartspace for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be part of any initiative that's trying to shed light on how to create with care in the modern world. I know all of us are trying to do that. I listened to the recording of last week's class and I really enjoyed hearing each of your backgrounds. We have a lot in common and I share many of your desires and concerns. My current practice is an effort to create a philosophical arc between my personal life and my creative practice. So a kind of a real meeting of the mind. In sharing my path, there's obviously no implicit or intention of implicit criticism of any other path. It's simply my journey, and I hope that it will incite dialogue and fuel continued growth for myself and anyone that finds it relevant. I'd like to share how I got to this point in my practice. So I will share a little bit about my background and the circuitous path to where I am now. I'm going to turn off my screen because it's easier for me to concentrate, but I'll be back after my slides and if you have any questions. So I'll go ahead and start my presentation. Yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you should be able to share your screen. Let me know if
Okay.
you have trouble.
All right, I'm going to do that now. And Anna, if there's any point you can't hear me or there's an issue, please interrupt.
Okay, I'll let you know. You sound great so far.
Good. Okay. All right, I'm a bit of a Luddite, so just bear with me for a second.
I think you might be in good company with some of us.
What is happening here? Hold on. Why is this just, sorry.
Okay.
I'm also on a new computer, so that's a bit of an issue. Okay, hold on, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Y'all can talk amongst yourselves. What is happening?
You need any help?
Well,
If you want to, you could share it with me and I could share my screen and go at your cue. Just an option.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Try that because for some reason I'm having trouble sharing my screen. Let me just share it with you right now on it, and then
Okay. Are you gonna send it through email?
yes, I will send it to you right now. Okay, it just went through to your email. Apologies.
No worries, it happens. If anybody wants to keep talking about Edward Bertinsky, you can keep that ball going. Okay. Whoops. Okay, just got it.
Okay.
Okay, so just give me the cue when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. So, go ahead on it and
Oh, next slide.
click through the next slide. Okay. So here we go. I was born to an English architect and a Midwestern farm girl, and they were both raised post-war when resources were scarce. Stories of frugal and creative problem solving were often shared around our dinner table. And my father designed rural healthcare facilities in Africa, and my mom marched on Washington in support of civil and environmental rights. So their influence inspired me to explore nature and political themes in my early paintings. But at university, like some of you here, I became disillusioned by what I perceived as kind of pretension and a lack of transparency in the fine arts. I felt at the time that there was a desire to be elusive as kind of a way to cultivate cool and conceptual thinking, and the fine art work being produced around me felt hollow and self-indulgent and plastic in the kind of original sense of the word. But in many cases, I now see it literally was plastic in a kind of material sense. So this inspired me to pursue applied arts at university, and I completed a degree in graphic communications with a focus in illustration. Okay, next slide. I spent the next 10 years in advertising and architecture as an art director. And while designing small and large scale work, I focused on waste reduction. I specified recycled paper where possible. I pulled nature themes into the built environment through signage and media installations. And it was during this time that I began to truly understand and become an advocate of quality over quantity in creative work. An idea I'm still pursuing passionately today. I saw real confirmation that work that had a higher consideration of concept and craft was more powerful. It felt like, you know, this idea of less is more. I really believed at this time too that my social awareness and responsibility was being expressed in a really principled way in my personal life and my creative work. I felt like I was advocating for all of the quote unquote right things. Next slide. It was when I took time off to raise my children and reflect on the next phase of my creative practice that I became increasingly aware of like a cognitive dissonance in my design and fine art work. The messaging and the themes were on point with my ideas and ethics, the things I believed in, but the materiality I felt was far from appropriate, being due to mainly heavy and petrochemicals. I started to question this unbridled modern impulse or kind of right to create, mainly through toxic materiality. And it was these words from Andrew Wyeth and those from the first slide from Gandhi, that there's no beauty in the finest cloth if it makes hunger and unhappiness, that really began to bother me. I realized that I could create something with the fullest intent of ethical expression, and it could be perfectly crafted, but that any beauty or value in that work was immediately diminished due to the inherent carbon cost of not just the materials, but the process of creating the work as well. You know, if an artist's truth is expressed through contradiction, is it even a truth? So I had to think deeper. Next slide. So I decided to look back in order to kind of look forward, and I revisited the historical precedents of art made as debate in social, political, and environmental justice. Here in Goya's, the 3rd of May on the left, the artist broke from the tradition of war paintings at the time that mostly celebrated victories. He wanted to show the senseless violence by shifting the perspective and making the victims the heroes, which hadn't really been done. When asked why he painted the picture, his answer was to warn men to never do it again. It was really a very strong warning. In Vermeer's painting The Girl with the Pearl Earring, the artist struggled immensely to scrounge up the money to buy and then hand process the precious lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to paint the woman's blue scarf. By honoring the precious pigment, in this way, the artist's experience making the work and thus the viewer's experience of viewing it were both elevated aesthetically and spiritually. So looking at work before the Industrial Revolution was inspiring, and I decided that.
So sorry, 1 second. I just was
That's okay.
trying to go back and then because I accidentally went forward. Do you want to go back here?
That's okay. Yeah. Yeah. In just a second. I was just going to say that looking at work before the Industrial Revolution was inspiring for me. And I decided that first off, making with toxic materiality was no longer an option for me. But beyond that, I had to think deeper about what I was trying to say in my work. And third, I had to completely alter my studio practice so that what I believed in was an ethically guided way to exist was being expressed holistically in my work, from the process to the pace of production to the spirit of the intent, and then of course the materials. Go ahead, Anna. Thank you. I want to share the exercise that I did myself during this time of reflection. I looked at a painting that I completed about 10 years ago as a case study to examine the potential for a high carbon cost of just a single piece of art. This is an explicit critique of my own work, so I take full responsibility here. So if you'll click on it just through, thank you so much. So first we have to consider the studio. To evaluate the cost of this work, I had to consider the space used to create the work. So the energy used to heat and cool a studio, the material integrity of the furniture that I work on, obviously the tools, where were the paintbrushes, pencils, erasers, everything made, where were they shipped from? Next, the substrate. In this case, it's an engineered wood panel. The processing and amount of adhesive used to compress wood fibers is significant. It could easily be a canvas in which the cotton would be grown on a farm with monoculture seeds, pesticides, agricultural waste, and paper is equally problematic. So that's the substrate. Clicking on next, the medium. In this case, acrylic paint and India ink. I've included a link from a recent study that finds, that's what you clicked on it, that paint is the largest source of microplastics in the ocean. Obviously, the fine art industry is only one component, one contributor, but it's certainly disconcerting fact to be associated with if you're a painter, right? This awful idea. Additionally, is commercial paints off-gas formaldehyde with lingering effects on the artist and the environment. Next, we look at pigment. Unless you're working with responsibly gathered earth pigments, the hue in commercial paints and inks are either lab-made or mined in open pits. Most of you know about earth mines having extreme effects on the land. They're usually in poor nations. They use child labor and unethical working conditions. So now we've just created the work. And now, or I had just created the work. Now moving on to promotion. So this is something that's really bothering me at the moment, considering the carbon cost of digital display. It's really hard to calculate, but every megapixel has a value that a data center has to process and the cloud has to archive, right? So excessive posting of content, unnecessarily oversized images, photo reels on phones, swiping through content, all of these things have a hard cost through tremendous amounts of water required to cool these big data centers, the mined minerals to make the computers that process all this information. Technology is the new hidden resource that we consume, without care in the way that we used to consume water. And finally, it keeps going, the cost of showing work. So to ensure that your work arrives intact at a gallery, a significant amount of packaging material is used. There's the fuel cost for transport and the material is used to prepare the galleries for hanging. So So with this unlimited materials, thanks to the internet and hobby stores and art supply stores, and then the self-granted right to expression, it's possible to generate work at an unprecedented speed, with a shocking cost to society. Vermeer patiently waited and saved money for a small vial of earth for a single painting. But today, we can paint landscape paintings that are inspired by, they're meant to honor the earth, and they're generally created through a desecration of the land, and a violation of human rights. Like a blood diamond, work made in this manner is ethically bankrupt. So it was this schism between the conceptual and the technical execution, resulting in this loss of truth and beauty, which is arguably kind of the main role of art in society, that was really bothering, really upsetting to me. So here we are. Seeking the truth can be painful. It was incredibly difficult for me to go through this process personally. But facing this reality meant that I could start to address this cognitive dissonance, and find a path forward. So a paradigm shift began to emerge for me. If you'll click on it, thank you. So overwhelmed at first by all of this new knowledge, I decided to focus on a single concept, resourcefulness. By definition, resourcefulness means able to find and use different ways to help you achieve your goals. The word also suggests kind of an inherent awareness of resources. Using what you already have, Anna, you touched on this, and what's locally available starts to address most hot topic issues that all of us in this group are concerned with: environmental racism, land stewardship, and obviously reducing one's footprint. Alternatively, if sourcing locally is not possible for a project, the internet affords the opportunity to source responsibly from independent suppliers who are more transparent in the ethics of their business, kind of voting with your dollar, if you will. But most importantly, it was considering the cost of each choice, was where I started. So going back to my upbringing, this idea that I could address the ethics of my practice through resourcefulness was this full circle moment for me. I want to look now at this concept through some makers who I think have done this very well. So if you'll click forward. So originally from present-day South Africa, the Ndebele culture fled and settled in Zimbabwe after war with the Zulu nation in the early 1800s. And the women brought with them this tradition of hut painting and geometric designs using earth-toned natural dyes. The grayish soil comes from anthill domes to make the gray and the white paints. The ash and charcoal residue from the fires is used to create the black and white, and the reds and brown.
Anna, I think you cut out. Is that just for me?
No,
No, I can't hear her.
Oh no.
I can't hear her either.
Anna? She.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you just cut out.
Okay, sorry
You
about that.
sound fine now.
Okay. Okay, well, I don't know where I stopped. There's a storm here locally, so I think it's affecting the connection. But so after spending so long painting, the annual rains wash it all away.
Wow.
And so this loss, though, is a welcome into the dry season, and it gives them just a fresh canvas to paint for the next year. So the artist here pictured set of her work. When I am here working, I don't have to worry. I breathe the fresh air. It brings me back to my inner center where I should be, which I thought is such a lovely idea. Moving on. So the Scotch distillers of the Highlands use a 5,000-year-old key ingredient. I don't know if anyone knows about Scotch and peat, but peat, shown here, comes from decayed moss and grass and flowering plants in northern latitudes of a cold climate. Once it's dry, these blocks of peat contain all of this latent energy of the dead vegetation and the sunshine that went into making them. So sometimes these blocks represent thousands of years of work by the earth. The smoke that comes up from the peat fire flavors the grain that makes the Scotch. So the smoke is beyond distinctive. It's also regional. It can't be replicated anywhere else in the world. So it's a slow process and the unique soil composition that have given Scotch this incredible luxury value. One more precedent I wanted to look at is the Tomo region of Japan is home to these historical buildings from the Edo period. And there's a longstanding practice here to repair these buildings, historical buildings where possible, and they break down old buildings and repurpose their materials in the construction of newer buildings. So a number of different traditional techniques are used in order to not waste wood. So 3 techniques they use to remove and mend the decayed sections of wood with new material. They have a technique to fix the base of a pillar where it's damaged, and then numeki is used when they have to fill in holes in old wood. When affixing these new materials, the same species of tree is used. They align the wood grain, and try to integrate it with the original material while keeping as much of the old wood intact as possible. The result is this kind of honest material intrusion. It's conservation, it honors craft, it preserves tradition, this really virtuous, lovely virtuous cycle. Moving on to my practice and what resourcefulness looks like for me. It's important to note here that I live in Southern California, so this is the regional lens from which I operate. It began for me during COVID lockdown when we were home as a family and our world was really small. And so it forced us to look closer at our surroundings. And one day my children found a gall in an oak tree in our yard. And Anna went through this, but remembering my art history and the prevalent use of gall ink, I made one small jar of ink. And suddenly we were noticing, if you'll click one more time, we were noticing galls everywhere, in the native oaks in our neighborhood. So looking for things to paint. One day my children found a hummingbird in the grass during migration season. So if you'll click through this was the bird we found, and this was my first effort right here to paint it. But I wasn't, it didn't quite capture the nature, the exquisite nature of this bird. So, and if you'll click one more time, I looked around for pink because I committed at this point to no new or toxic materials. So I had these limits to what I could work with. So I dried some bougainvillea petals in the yard and thought I could use that to capture the pink feathers on this bird. And then I needed to darken the ink. So like you presented, I made iron oxide by putting nails and vinegar. And then the result was this small little painting. And that felt really good to make. I was happy with it, which I hadn't been happy with my work for some time. So it led to spending the next year recording things that we found on walks with only material I could make right here at home from the yard. So circling to harmony had started for me. If you'll click through again, it was these three materials that opened the envelope of possibilities. So you can just click through on but next I noticed ochre when I was hiking. I noticed pomegranates in the yard, clay at the edge of a local lake, avocados in a neighbor's yard. I started noticing sticks and eggshells from my chickens for pigment. I noticed green earth pigment along the coast, straws, microplastics, stones, eucalyptus wood in the yard, charcoal from campfires, and then it was, one more privet berries that grow in my yard that I had never really noticed before. So once
what is this?
Avocado skins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny picture. So once I set about to take advantage of what was around me, there seemed kind of no foreseeable end to it. This was all just right here within a stone's throw of my house. In order to meet this new self-imposed criteria of creating a true harmony in my practice, I had to set parameters for foraging these natural and man-made materials. I felt like it wouldn't meet the kind of spirit of my intentions if I began to actively pursue or need a certain material to create with. So if you'll click forward, I share this article with a link if you're interested that kind of explores the potential harm of an aggressive pursuit to create.
I'll just throw this in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So to avoid this kind of aggressive pursuit of materials, the Luiseño tribe are indigenous here to Southern California, and they have a foraging philosophy called How We Gather. And it was inspiring for me to kind of go through a methodology before I started gathering. So you see they kind of have these steps of, asking permission, acknowledging that it's not just an inherent right to take, express gratitude, state the intent of your gathering, and gather in such a way that if you're gathering from nature that you benefit the plant, not just lopping the top off, but not gathering when a plant is flowering and other considerations. I'll add that when I pick things up in nature while I'm walking, I try to collect a piece of litter along the way as a kind of rebalancing gesture, just trying to really think mindfully about what I'm doing and how I'm proceeding. So I'll go through the local material that I use. I've lumped them into 4 groups. If you'll click through, we'll talk first about my ink making. So my ink making materials come from the trees and plants that are here on my property, those 3 listed at the top, or kind of byproducts of the lifestyle that speak to my region. There are many resources, Anna, like you shared, that can show you how to make dye from food scraps and flowers, industrial waste. So there's kind of endless possibility for anyone who wants to make ink. For me, I've limited myself at the moment to these 6 inks, mainly because pomegranate and galls and privet berries grow on my property. So I enjoy the process of walking out in the yard and collecting the material. Avocados come from a neighbor, which is a nice relationship. The charcoal is from the winter fires in my stove that we used to heat our house. And then living in a wine valley, there's access to grapes, which is the only crop that can be grown here locally without additional water or amending the soil. So I like supporting the grape agriculture and farming here. The palette that results from these feels harmonious to the region, in addition for me. The next material is to expand my palette beyond these inks. I began pressing flowers from the garden. I enjoy this because it has the added benefit of inspiring me to plant more native species each year. So it kind of pushes my gardening. The next one are, let's see, there should be one. Can you go back one slide? Thank you. Well, maybe not. Maybe I have this out of order. So there's there we go, the natural materials. Thank you, you're really doing a super job. For the natural materials, I don't collect on protected or conservation land, and most importantly to me, I don't kind of go out of my way to look for these materials. I prefer to come upon them, you know, when I'm out walking or hiking. Driving together these materials to me just, it adds would add to the carbon cost, and it would kind of upset the spirit of a slower pursuit of finding materials. And then lastly, the plastic and construction detritus is just everywhere. So there's infinite trash for everyone to use. So just moving on from here quickly to how these materials have translated into finished work for me in the last 3 years. That first hummingbird led to 24 small paintings that I did from life. These are made exclusively with the yard, with things I found in my yard, except for the gold leaf, and it's in several of them. That's recycled gold leaf, so it's an exception to my rule. But these pieces pushed my ink making craft and my intimacy with the flowering plants around me. And they became kind of like a journal recording of my days. So if you click through one time more, you can see in detail kind of the juxtaposition of the pressed plants with my inks. So one more click. So this is the pressed plants and flowers, some examples of how they've translated into work. I feel like I've only begun to scratch the surface of what I could do with plants, but this is a portrait on the left of my son. He loves the ocean, and so I pressed some seaweed and things I found walking on the beach, and then captured his likeness, and it was a fun piece to make. And then on the right, it's just a typographic expression. It's all flowers from the yard. But this kind of rush to embrace science when it liberates you to get the vaccine, but then the hesitancy to kind of show the same enthusiasm in terms of climate science is more of this cognitive dissonance that I've been exploring in myself and around me. So moving on to some larger scale ink works. These are 2 pieces of sea fragments that are 15 times their original scale, so they're large pieces. I use the inks that I make from the land to explore these small pieces I found on the coast, and it was for me a way of looking deeper at objects that I'd previously stepped over. And drawing these connections between the land and the sea is a theme that I keep circling. So the next 2 are paintings of a 20-piece series that I started last year after walking. We had a lot of snow here in California, and walking through these wildfire ravaged forests, I found this juxtaposition of the trees against this snow, kind of representative of how despair and hope sit side by side. So these were, it was at the same time I learned how to make white tempera with crushed eggshells, so it made this work possible to kind of capture these burned trees and tree trunks. Moving on to 2 recently completed pieces. These are even larger in scale. but I incorporated 3 new inks in these, and I'm finding the organic process of working with these inks that they respond to each other in really surprising ways. So the winter storms here in California kind of littered the coastline with these vibrantly colored lobster and crab shells. And there was just this incredible color on the beach that came out of these really gray seas and these monochrome coasts. And it was, you know, seeing that color juxtaposed with these monochrome coastlines was something I really felt compelled to try and capture. Moving forward, there's, you can see the first sketch on the right of these lobster skeletons, and then a detail of that piece we just looked at that shows how I'm starting to layer my inks and how they sit together. They sometimes blend and then sometimes they resist each other. So it's always kind of a surprising interaction. So I'm still very much learning. Moving on, this is a series I've been exploring. I call this my wood and waste series. These began as an exercise to see what I could do simply by arranging what I could gather. No additional materials or manipulation. So I closed down my studio in the summer for family time. So the first 2 pieces were a result of this collecting over the summer months during our travels. And then back in the studio, these compositions came together and became really like a memory of time and place. And the piece on the right was one of several campfire charred wood sculptures that I made and inlaid with found plastics. So these 3 works led to my largest collection of wood and waste. It's now at over 100 pieces. This collection consists of only found material locally. They're connected. Initially, the pieces of wood and the waste that I found are connected rather with straws, just plastic straws I found in waste bins and along the side of the road. But then I expanded these connections to mechanical pens and pencils and caps and tubes and other things that I could connect with. I don't use any adhesive in this work because of the added toxicity, but the benefit of that is that it creates this modularity, so I can take them apart and rearrange them, and ultimately I could recycle the work if it got to that point. So I'm noticing that materials begin to relate in these new and surprising ways. If you click forward, you can see in these detail shots that I've picked up all along the way: fishing tackle and glow sticks, bones, seeds. You know, there's just endless things to be found out while walking, and so they've worked their ways into these compositions. And finally, so one more collection that I've been working on in the last few years, and this collection here it represents a year of natural material vessels made exclusively of found wood and lake clay from a local lake here. I've sculpted these pieces and then nested inside them other objects I've found. So you can see there's, you know, seeds and shells and stones and, you know, you can see the variety of things, but things that I found that felt special and kind of sacred, and you know, this idea of connecting them into these vessels. And this is all just material that I found, and kind of manipulating it in a way that is new and surprising is what I've enjoyed most about it. So just the first pieces, just a couple more slides here on my work, but the first pieces were these ones, and they were kind of a material marriage in which the wood and then the clay vessels related in color and form to the objects that were inside them. So, you know, you can see there's lava rock and shell and bone and coral and things I picked up, and then I kind of housed them in a vessel that related in terms of color and form. And then you can see on the left, because I don't glue any of it in, the pieces kind of can come in and out. Later in this series, I was exploring kind of contrast and color and form so that a different dialogue emerges. The ones on the right house seeds, and then the ones on the left are things that my children have found that were special to them, that I created kind of a holding place for them. So where I am now, the process of discovering the materials is organic, and then making the connections is playful, and then the process of creation is slow. And the idea that I could then bury it all in the earth and they would return to the soil quickly and cause no harm, it was just a new idea for me, and felt liberating as a kind of creative person. So this body of work that I've just shown came after a really long break from art making for me. I took about 10 years off to raise my children, and it was during this time that I was intensely nurturing and playing that this work came out of, and those qualities I feel like are reflected in these pieces. But everyone's journey is so different, and perhaps at some point you're caring for an aging parent, or you're tending a sick friend, or you're homebound. And you know, the question I ask is, what does that look like for you? How can you pull from the life that you are living in a resourceful manner? I feel like, you know, I've only just begun and I have so much work to do. For me, the last couple slides, reflecting on an artist's impulse to create and the kind of ethical implications of that impulse lead to a more considered practice. You know, we live in a time where there's just no end to stuff, for lack of a better word. So there's just tremendous existing materiality. So whether it's a fabric store, or grocery store, or lumber yard that has waste that could be put to use, or food for dyeing, scraps for weaving, wood for sculpting. Obviously, park trash cans are overflowing, and roadsides are covered in litter for repurposing. But also in the natural world, the hillsides and pastures around us offer abundant material to work with. And I feel like there's a unique path forward for everyone, and with many benefits. So just clicking through, I've kind of listed some things that I found that have benefits of working in a more considered way. You know, if you slowing down your practice leads to more mindful making and kind of less burnout, as you're not working at such a frenetic pace. Work rooted in time and place yields a greater authenticity. Value is created through regionalism. You know, it's unique. Your voice is unique. Limiting materials often yields more creative work. And material discovery over material pursuit offers a kind of more romantic or soulful experience when you discover your own materials. And I feel like that leads to more personally rewarding work. It connects you to the history of our discipline, of craft making, creates a path to a holistic activism. It addresses a kind of excessive production of work and kind of promotes a full circle work that could return to the earth. It kind of helps you avoid kind of greenwashing, moving beyond acknowledgement of issues into actual practice. It reminds us of where we come from and our relationship with the landscape and the things that allow us to exist. And ultimately, it supports a shift in the kind of cultural practices of our discipline, a vote for ethical making. And so in conclusion, I wanted to share this clip if we have time, or you can watch this on your own. But it's the English philosopher Alain de Botton, and he examines through the architect Louis Kahn's work the question that I am pursuing in my own work. So if there's time, we can watch it. Otherwise, we can end there and just do Q&A on it. It's up to you.
We've got just enough time. Let's watch it.
Okay.
Yeah.
For thousands of years, the most common building materials have been stone, brick, and wood. They've also been the most charming, aging beautifully and suggesting a special kind of nobility and strength. When modernist architecture was born in the early 20th century, traditional materials quickly gave way to the three quintessential modern ingredients: concrete, steel, and sheet glass. The result has in far too many cases appeared brutal, uncaring, and alienating. The buildings have not aged very well either. Could modern architects not learn to work with traditional materials while retaining the forms and the spirit of our own times? This is the question so beautifully answered by one of the greatest of all modernists, the American architect Louis Kahn. Kahn was born in Russia in 1901 and emigrated with his parents to the US at the age of 3. As a young man, he studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, but his career truly blossomed in the 1950s after a trip to Rome led him to a new appreciation of the beauty of ancient Roman architecture. Kahn's major contribution to modern architecture was to include ancient elements in his work without losing the innovation and clarity of modernism. He reminded the modernists that they could be in dialogue with their most illustrious predecessors. One symptom of this successful rehabilitation of the old was Kahn's affection for symmetry, which many modern architects had come to view as authoritarian, unimaginative, and conformist. Kahn designed the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, as a complex of buildings, identical on either side of a central fountain, a symmetry characteristic of what is known as the Beaux-Arts style. Kahn was unperturbed by this apparent regression. If people want to see Beaux-Arts, it's fine with me, he said. I'm as interested in good architecture as anybody else. Like a city planner for 19th century Paris or Berlin, Kahn used identical rows of buildings to draw the viewer's eye to the center of his design and out beyond it. The fountain that runs through the center of the institute aligns with the path of the sun on both the autumnal and vernal equinox. Kahn used symmetry not as an aesthetic default, but with great intentionality to provide one with a sense of balance, focus, and momentum. Kahn also managed to create a feeling of grandeur rarely seen in modern architecture. We might gape at the height of a skyscraper, but rarely does it evoke the kind of awe that a great cathedral can generate. Kahn managed to reintroduce a feeling of magnificence into modern works. In the Yale Center for British Art, he draws the viewer's eyes upwards to the high windowed ceiling, much as though it were the dome of a church. Even the staircases create a sense of lofty space and height. Rather than resorting only to steel, concrete, and glass, Kahn regularly sought out a wide variety of older and more sensory materials. He worked with the best consultants to find new uses for ceramic, copper, and especially brick. Kahn liked cleverly to juxtapose older and newer materials, like oak with concrete. We tend to associate oak with tradition, Victorian smoking rooms or solemn libraries, while concrete reminds us of impersonal factories and remote futuristic buildings. But put together, the two mediums demonstrate strikingly different, yet remarkably complementary virtues. The wood gives off a feeling of warmth and domesticity, while concrete provides a sense of strength and stability. The combination subtly promises a reconciliation between the old and the new, between comfort and security. Kahn was drawn to the idea of making buildings that would feel like monuments, at a time when most modern architects firmly rejected monuments as authoritarian and sentimental. In 1938, the architectural critic Louis Mumford had declared, "If it's a monument, it's not modern. If it's modern, it cannot be a monument." But Kahn rather liked the feeling of authority and was confident enough in his democratic credentials not to mind borrowing from some of the moves of more dictatorial regimes. After his important trip to Rome, he wrote, "I finally realized that the architecture of Italy will remain as the inspirational source of all works of the future. Those who don't see it that way ought to look again. Our stuff looks tiny compared to it." His most substantial building was perhaps the National Assembly in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Though recognizably modern, it also seems in some ways eternal in its massiveness. echoing to the memories of the cathedrals, the great mosques, and even the pyramids. Many of Khan's buildings feel luxurious, but this isn't the luxury of glitz or gold of an oil-rich kingdom, rather the luxury of buildings that aspire to still be around in 600 years' time, the luxury of eternity. The Kimball Art Museum in Texas uses travertine marble, white oak, and concrete arranged in 300-foot bays, each fronted by an open, barrel-vaulted portico. It's possibly the most beautiful building in the world. When Khan died in 1974, he was the most famous architect in the United States, and he remains deeply influential to this day. His ultimate importance lay in his ability to transcend dogmatic modernism and return the best elements of traditional architecture to their rightful place in the canon. He reminds us that the real goal of buildings isn't so much to shock, dazzle, or confuse, as to be the equals of the venerable buildings we've long loved in the ancient world.
You can go ahead and stop it there. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Our online shop has
Oh,
a range
hold
of
on.
books and gifts
Okay.
that address the most.
Wow.
Okay, and then there was just one more slide, but I wanted to end on the inspiring words of the American poet and potter, Mary Caroline Richards. She said that all the arts we practice are apprenticeship, and that the big art is our life. And so that's an idea that I'm carrying forward from this point. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Anna. What a beautiful presentation.
Oh, thank you, and sorry, thank you for your assistance. You did a
Yeah, no, it was just beautifully laid out and gorgeous documentation. And it was so informative to walk through your process of really reorienting in your practice by asking these questions and then like staying with the trouble of that and letting it shape the way that you move forward and found yourself engaging in really fascinating practices. It was really cool to see more of your work.
Thank you. Well, thank
Yeah.
you.
It is 4, so if anybody wants to go, they can go. But if you're up for it, if there's 1 or 2 questions, but no pressure. Anybody have a question? Okay, maybe we could just end there. Well, thank you so much, Anna.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you. Thanks, all of you.
I'll see everybody next Saturday, same time.
Thank you.
Have a
Okay.
great
Have a good
week.
weekend.
Bye.
Bye.